Some of you might have taken the subtle hint at the end of our last video that should maybe give you a start as to how we can implement this functionality for handling the pop-up button tabs in the game scene, like we talked about. We will of course be using a protocol delegate pattern to achieve this. I'll begin implementing it in the pop-up file, where I will, above the struct for the pop-up buttons, create a new protocol, which I will call Pop-up Button Handler Delegate. This protocol would then contain 3 required methods for the 3 different button tabs by adding func menu tabbed, func next tabbed, and finally func retry tabbed, so that I can handle all of my 3 buttons with this protocol. Inside of the class popup, I would then add a new property, which is a variable called Pop-up Button Handler Delegate, which will be of our new type of the protocol. But it will be optional, and we will set this property from our game scene later on. We will return to the game scene in a second, but before we do so, we will now already use this new property to complete the pop-up button handler method in the pop-up class, which will be called when the buttons are tabbed. But since we are using the protocol delegate pattern, pretty much all we need to add here is passing the information about the tab button along to the delegate. I'll write a switch statement for the index parameter to find out which button was tabbed. I will then check the case pop-up buttons.menu, in which case I will just call pop-up button handler delegate.menu tabbed, and next is the case pop-up buttons next, in which case I will call pop-up button handler delegate.next tabbed, and finally the case pop-up buttons.retry, where I will obviously call pop-up button handler delegate.retry tabbed. For the default case, I will just add a break statement to be sure, even though this shouldn't really happen in our app. Alright, depending on which button we tap, we do now call the appropriate method on the delegate property, which we now of course have to set to an actual value, and then make sure the methods all exist in the appropriate places. We can now, after completing the pop-up file with this, go back into our game scene Swift file, where we will implement the game scene itself as the delegate. Now let's think about how and where we want to show the pop-ups and where we will need to add the button handlers. Showing the pop-up is pretty clear, and we already kind of talked about it. Once it will be in the add bird method, where we have this game over state here. If there are still enemies in the scene, at this point, we will of course need to show our stage failed pop-up. The other situation would be down here in the didBegin contact method, when we remove an enemy, and then all the way at the top in our didSetObserver of the enemy's property, register that there aren't any enemies left. In this case, we would of course want to show the success pop-up, since we actually cleared the level. To show the pop-up, I will create a new method in the game scene class. I will add it right below, constraint to anchor, and I will call my new method present pop-up with the parameter victory of type bool. I can then just use this parameter to check whether the user has cleared the level or not. Inside of the method, I can then just check if victory, in which case we would present the cleared pop-up, and in the else part we can present the failed pop-up. But let's begin with the part where we did clear the level. I will define a constant pop-up, which I will initialize as a pop-up instance with the type 0, which, if you remember correctly, will create a cleared pop-up. And for the size, I will say frame.size, which is the complete size of our frame, so that our pop-up gets properly sized. Next, I will set 2 properties for the pop-up, beginning with popup.zPosition, which I will set to zPosition.hotBackground to make sure our pop-up is rendered above all the other elements currently visible in the scene. And then I want to set popup.popupButtonHandlerDelegate property, which I will set to self, to be able to now handle the delegate calls in a GameScene class. I will get an error right away, since as of now, the GameScene class does not conform to this protocol. And we do not have the required methods, those 3 required methods implemented. I will fix this in a second. But before we do so, I'll also add my pop-up by writing GameCamera.addChild and then pass the pop-up. Now, why do we add this as a child to the camera node? Basically, this will avoid that our pop-up moves or scales when the camera moves, but just always stays in the center of our view with the same size and position, which is what we would expect as the user of a game. To get rid of our error now, I want to fix this before continuing in the else part. I will add this protocol conformance in another extension below, right below the class, which will be extension, GameScene, and then after a colon, we adopt the pop-up button handler delegate protocol. I then have to implement the 3 required methods, of course, which I can quickly do by selecting this proposed fix to add the protocol stubs, and I now only have to add the code that my method should execute when called. But before we do that, I want to complete the present pop-up method, where we are still missing the else part, where our user has failed the level. It will be pretty similar, so I can just copy and paste this whole part here, and pretty much the only thing that I want to change is the type of my pop-up being 1. In this case, it should show the other pop-up. Looking at it this way, this code is actually a little redundant, but I will leave it to you as a small challenge to figure out how we could actually make this method a little better or a little cleaner and with less repetition of code. For now, I will come back to the extension where we are going to handle our tabs for menu, next, and retry. But what do we want to do here? For menu, it's pretty simple, since we can just write scene manager delegate .present level scene. I do think it makes more sense if this button only brings us back to the level selection and not our menu, so our main menu. But you could of course just as well call present menu scene if you would like to. You can already see why this makes a lot of sense to handle the tabs here, since we pretty much have all the functionality in place to react properly to them. For the next tabbed and retry tabbed, it is a little more complicated, since in these cases we will obviously present a new game scene here. This game scene does need a level parameter though, and since the level property of the game scene, containing the level we are currently playing, is optional, I will have to start by checking if that level is level to get a non-optional value if possible. And if I get this level, I can for the next tab method add scene manager delegate .present game scene for level and then pass level +1 to get to the next level. Since we can only use this button if the user has cleared the level, I do not need to check this here anymore. For retry, I can then add if let level is level and then use scene manager delegate .present game scene for level, where I now just reload the scene with the same level as before. Now, to actually show our pop-up, we will now have to make sure the method present pop-up is actually called in the right places. We talked about it briefly earlier in this lecture, so the first location will be all the way at the top here, but we can just replace the print for all enemies hit with a call to present pop-up with the parameter true. For the other case, we will scroll to the addBird method, where we as of now have the game overprint. which we can then replace with a call to present popup and a parameter false to present our stage failed popup. To make sure that as soon as our popup is present, we will not be able to use our usual user interactions with the scene, I will, to complete the game scene, add a last round state to my enumeration at the very top. It will be called game over, and I want to set it when we present the popups. So right here in the did setup server with round state set to .game over, and then in the add bird method where I will write round state is equal to .game over. The word game over in this case doesn't necessarily have to mean that we failed, but more generally that this round is over. I do have one error left, which pops up because this new round state is not yet handled in the touches began method, in the switch for the round state property. And to make this exhaustive again, I will at the very bottom add case.gameover, which will also get a break statement, since in this state we do not want to handle anything but the touches on our pop-up buttons, which have their own recognizer. Theoretically, this would all work now. There is a slight problem with our code, which would cause major problems if we didn't fix it. If we do handle our pop-up button tabs like we do here, there is a small little thing that is really easy to forget about. You could think that if we now load a complete new game scene and then present it, everything would get deleted and initialized fresh, and this shouldn't give us any problems. But it is only partly true, since we did a little while ago add something in the game scene class that will ruin this near perfect plan and ultimately would make the user interaction with the game scene impossible. It's a really small little detail which an inexperienced developer would probably not recognize and could spend hours to fix. And to see what I'm talking about, let's jump to the method setup gesture recognizers. Okay, let's have a look. What do we have here? We are referencing our view and then create our two gesture recognizers and add them to this view. But which view is it now exactly? This is the SpriteKit view from our GameViewController class. And if I go back to this GameViewController and take a look at our extension, I can clearly see that this view is never reinitialized. We always just reference the same old view for any scenes to present. Some of you may already recognize the problem that exists here. If I do present a new scene now, I will always still have the old gesture recognizers in this view, which is a problem, especially if we are presenting a new game scene. I do add more gesture recognizers, and even though I do disable them, so meaning the current pan recognizer and touches began here, the old or even multiple old pan recognizers in the view would not be disabled and make interactions impossible. Lucky for us, when we know about this problem, there is an easy fix that we can, in the GameViewController extension, add to the present method down here, inside of the if-let statement. Alright, if-let gesture recognizers is view.gesture-recognizers, which will give me an array of all the gesture recognizers currently added to this view, if there are any. I can then write a for loop to remove all of them with for recognizer in gesture recognizers, and then in the for loop write view.remove gesture recognizer and recognizer to remove all of them. This makes sure that anytime I present a new scene, any possibly existing gesture recognizers get removed, and we can really start with a fresh scene. Alright, it is finally time to run the app again, and if all of this works, we should be able to get our pop-up shown if we either hit all enemies or if we've used all of our birds. I'll start my level 1, and in the beginning nothing is different. I will now try to destroy my enemy here. Okay, as soon as I launch my second bird and hit the enemy, we should see the pop-up. And voila, there it is, correctly stating stage cleared. So for the second test, I will just waste all my birds without hitting the enemy to see if the other pop-up shows as well. This will just take a second, but as soon as I drop my last bird to the ground and then wait a second for the add bird method to be called, I can now see the other pop-up. If I then tap on menu, I get back to my level scene. Perfect! Our pop-ups and the pop-up buttons are working just fine.